Okay, hi everybody. Hello. Welcome to this 3 o'clock session. My name's Annalisa Steffen. I'll be the timekeeper for your session today. We will hear today about the creative challenges and potential of working with ASL in your museum. And here we have Julie Treumann. She's the Chief Creative Officer at AcoustiGuide, which creates interpretive guides and creative content. She's also pursuing, oh good.
Yeah, sorry.
Little trick there. She's also pursuing a master's in art history and has a long abiding interest in food justice issues, which may explain why she has such a peculiar Twitter handle, which you will see on screen in one moment. Alison Koch.
Yep.
Wow, amazing. I pronounced someone's name right. Is a digital product manager for web and interactives at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York. And she's currently soliciting recommendations for her trip to Sri Lanka in November. So if anyone's been there, make sure to talk to her. And lastly, Lorena Bradford is head of accessible programs at the National Gallery, where she oversees programs for the deaf and hard of hearing, for visitors with vision loss, visitors with memory loss and their care partners, and for medical and nursing students and professionals, which is a very cool job. She's also prone to geek out about anything related to Elvis, which is not related to this presentation, but connect with her afterwards if you're an Elvis head. All right, with no further ado.
All right. I'm going to kind of drift between the podium and my chair because I prefer an anti-hierarchical presentation. So I just wanted to start by saying I appreciated the German pronunciation of my name. And I think if we had titled this Getting to Yes as a contrast to Shannon's presentation, the room might be fuller. Okay. So we are really excited about this session. I have worked very closely with both Alison and Lorena on American Sign Language projects, and the idea was born when I started to look around at conference panels and realized that there are a lot of conference panels about accessibility at museum conferences, but they're usually about audio description, and they're not about American Sign Language, and so we wanted to try to rectify that. And this opening slide will make much more sense in a few minutes. All right, we're going to introduce ourselves now. Lorena, take it away.
So I'm the head of accessible programs at the National Gallery of Art, and wanted to just share how and why I came to and currently engage with American Sign Language, or ASL. I've been in this position for 3 years. It's a new job at the gallery. Previously, I was working in another role in education. And in that time, so long before there was kind of an accessible programs program area, we had an exhibition of Hendrik Averkamp, who is a 17th century Dutch artist of winter scenes. Wonderful. And he was known to be deaf. And so we collaborated with Gallaudet University, which is probably the largest deaf university in the country. Yeah. And they're right in D.C. And so we gave tours in American Sign Language, and I parlayed that into a monthly ASL at the NGA tour. That's sort of a highlights tour for adults, and then just added a monthly ASL family tour for families with kids 5 to 11, although we get all ages, including adults only, to explore the gallery in that way.
That's me. I'm Alison Koch. I work at the 9/11 Museum in New York, and I am a digital product manager, which means I have actually very little to do with the accessibility programs in the museum, but I come to it through my own kind of personal interest. So we do also have a manager of access programs at our institution who is responsible for the formal programming for communities like the deaf community, but I just happened to fall in love with it from the early days of Sesame Street and Linda Bove, and just continue to pursue it through the course of my life. So I've been working kind of in more technical stuff as opposed to museum things, but got laid off from AOL in the grand layoff of 2009, and went back to school and actually got a deaf studies degree because I loved it so much. So have kind of been able to play with that, and it has really kind of opened the door for me of thinking about technology from a different perspective. So I get to play with ASL in my job, luckily, even though it's not part of my job description.
I just wonder if you need to explain what AOL is to most of the people.
America Online.
In my role at AcoustiGuide, I had never thought that I would be interested in All-American Sign Language. This came about very organically. We've been doing ASL tours for, I think 2008 was our first one for the United Nations. And as time has worn on, I have really fallen in love with the language, with the people I have worked with, including these two. And liked it so much that I ended up taking a 4-week class in it over the summer, so that the only thing I remember is Queens. That's the borough I live in, New York. I don't remember anything else from that class, but like I'm very interested in that language and how it works. So that's my story, and I will continue up here. This is our big disclaimer. We are not deaf and don't speak for the deaf community. We are holding this session to sort of share our personal experiences with you so you understand what it might be like if you are a hearing person to think about working with ASL in a museum. So this is the background for people who may or may not know anything about ASL. Lorena, take it away.
Actually, Allison, take it.
Oh, sorry, Alison, take it
No
away.
problem. So we're starting with the basics. Obviously, we don't assume that anybody in this room has any particular exposure to it. If you do, fantastic. Jump in and correct me if I'm saying anything crazy. But basically, we just want to clarify a couple of things. That sign language is not universal. It is just as different as speaking different languages in different countries. And actually, sign languages that are from different English-speaking countries sometimes actually have less in common than you would think. So American Sign Language is actually based on French Sign Language, and Australian and British Sign Language look completely different, have a totally different manual alphabet, even though it would be the same spoken language in those countries. American Sign Language has been used by generations of deaf families, but it isn't the only way that people who are deaf communicate. Not everyone chooses to use a manual language. Some people are raised with oralism, they learn to lip read, but also some people develop home signs or they use cued speech. There's lots of different ways that the deaf community communicates with each other and with the outside world. So when choosing to present things in American Sign Language, don't assume that everybody who is deaf is going to use it the way that you initially kind of created it. Great, and then you want to talk
So
about
one
gloss?
final point, when we transition from spoken English or written English to ASL, we sometimes create what's called a gloss. You might think of this as an interpretation or a translation. It's still in English, the way that our original script might be, but in terms of the videos that we'll be talking about in a little bit, the gloss is sort of a almost like a roadmap for the signer to know which signs to use and also which directions to use it, because it's visual language and it uses really much of the body. So how to set up the information in very specific ways that departs from spoken English. So when we use the word gloss later on, that's what we're talking about. It's sort of an interpreted script almost.
Great. So in preparing for this presentation, one of the things that I discovered as part of my sort of awakening with ASL is once you know about it, you see it everywhere. And there have been a host of sort of pop culture mentions of it. It's been featured in movies a lot, and we found all these really juicy headlines that we could pull from. So the point of this is sort of just to talk about why ASL is so different. It's faster and more expressive at interpreting English, and it's able to convey emotions and tonal flexions that wouldn't be readily apparent to a non-hearing audience member. Alison.
Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a program and then some related digital content that came from it. So the 9/11 Memorial Museum hosted an ASL Slam in September of 2016 in conjunction with our celebration of the 15th anniversary of the attacks, and it also happens to be Deaf Awareness Month in September. So ASL Slam is actually a group of performers. It was founded in 2005, and their mission is to provide a space for literary and performing artists in the deaf community to present, create, and develop their works in front of a live audience. So ASL poets, storytellers, performers, they kind of are all of those things, spent time exploring an art exhibition that also opened in the same year, and they each chose a piece to create a performance around. So all of these performances were these beautiful, emotional things that were almost more like a dance than they were like an actual story or something that you could kind of assign words to. So we wanted to make this content available to the people who are coming into the gallery to view that art. We were challenged, however, by the idea of how to scaffold an experience of seeing something in ASL for a hearing visitor who may not have any exposure to this. So it was a very fascinating question of almost accessibility in the reverse. Normally you're asking yourself, how do I make something that I created for a general audience accessible to somebody who can't see or can't hear? But in this case, it was how do I make something that was created for the deaf community accessible to the hearing world?
So we actually decided in viewing these videos not to caption them. So we did not provide a word-for-word, hand gesture for hand gesture interpretation. We actually tried to just give people tools in order to kind of structure the way that they might look at it, things to look for, things to notice, and kind of give them sort of a roadmap for what this might be. So we can go to the, yeah, there you go, great. So these are the kind of opening slides that show up. So it tells you first what, I actually covered it on mine. This performance is a response to Manju Chandler's gesture, which as you can see behind this piece here, it explores the theme of remembrance. It's entirely in American Sign Language, and it's intended to be both formal language, informal gesture, and emotion. So it's sort of just kind of setting you up. But then the next part,
Want me to flip back?
yes, please, is giving you some things to look for. So we're going to show you this video, and this will sort of give you some tools here. So this performance is a lot about playing with scale and time. So look for some really small details that become large structures. A bead of sweat drips down and becomes one of the Twin Towers, or a teardrop falls to create the memorial pool. That second part you won't see. But watch for hand gestures that look like a time-lapse film, the sun rising and setting rapidly, or buildings under construction rising into the sky, floor by floor. Oh, I think you have to fast forward.
Fast forward. Too much, right?
It's just the same
Another
thing.
minute.
I'll let it go. It'll be there gone in a minute. It was the whole point of
It's
cutting it out.
fascinating
so
for
there
the
was
audience listening at home. Worried I don't want to miss the beginning.
There you go.
Okay, there we go.
You can stop it there. If it
Stop
wants
it?
to stop itself. Yeah.
Okay.
So that final gesture there, if you can sort of imagine his hands, he has one is the South Tower and one is the North Tower with the antenna. So it's not something that you can translate literally. It would not make any sense if you actually put words to all that. So we wanted to make sure people felt that they could access it and appreciate the beauty of it.
And one of the things I love about that video is I don't actually need to know exactly what he's saying to appreciate it. So beautiful. Okay. So on to our next chapter. How do you describe abstract ideas with ASL? Lorena.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about a project, and I just wanted to introduce the background because I think it's useful in understanding the video that the clip of the video that I'll be showing. The gallery, the National Gallery, was established in 1941. It focuses on art made in Europe and America from about 1400 to today. And it's made up of two buildings, and the East Building is opened in 1978. It's an IMP building, and he did the glass pyramids at the gallery before he did the glass pyramid at the Louvre. But that's our modern and contemporary collection. So it opened in 1978, has been up and running since then, and it was time for renovation several years ago. So the galleries in the East Building all closed down for a renovation. We also took the opportunity to sort of reimagine the collection and how we were presenting it. So the curator totally reinstalled the entire building, told new stories, came up with new ideas for how to present the art and how it connected to each other. All of the art in the East Building was made after about 1900 or so. So the building itself reopened just about a year ago in September 2016. And as part of the opening celebration, we had an audio tour made of 30 highlights from the East Building. This is sort of the traditional learning more about the artist and the work of art, the impact that it had. We heard from curators, artists, all kinds of different voices. To build on that and increase the accessibility, we had 2 additional projects that built on that 30-stop tour. For each of those works of art, we wrote and recorded verbal description, which is available online so anyone can access it, either in the museum or remotely. And we also created an ASL video to interpret the information into American Sign Language. So that's what I'll be talking about here. So when we were talking about this Mondrian painting, he's an early 20th century Dutch artist known for his sort of irregular grids. This painting, for the sake of the recording, shows a diamond-shaped work rather than the square that we often think of. And it has a kind of uneven ladder on it filled with different colors of white in most of the grids, with one triangle of red, one of yellow, one of black, and one of blue scattered around the edges. When we came to, when the curator, Harry Cooper, was talking about this work, he said this, and forgive me for just reading my slide, but I think it's really important to get into the language here. He said, quote, "What you get is a real challenge, because almost everything is going to be cut by the edge sooner or later. Probably sooner rather than later. So the structure that was so stable and comfortable for him, for Mondrian, really gets threatened by these edges. I think we start to feel a great deal of dynamism. Mondrian liked to talk about dynamic equilibrium. So when it came time to interpret this into American Sign Language, it wasn't just finding the signs for something like dynamic equilibrium, which they don't really exist. It's really getting at what was he saying? What was the meaning underlying this? This is a curator talking about a work from that perspective. So when the interpreting team came up with the gloss, here's how they interpreted it. And I'm going to read the slide again. So the words they used to guide their signs were move, 45-degree tilt, meaning color at bottom will cut off. His idea of structure, horizontal, horizontal, vertical, vertical, stable, comfortable, used to, perfect. Tilt painting causes danger, means inside have conflict, tension, tension with each other. Mondrian himself likes explain tension, tension, equilibrium. So it's really getting at a lot of the same ideas. We have a slide that has the 2 quotes together, if that's useful for you. Do we? Maybe we don't. There it is.
Well, that's just one of them. Sorry, some reasons didn't pop up in the right way.
They're on the same slide, but don't show up
anyway,
at the same time.
Maybe we should
That's
just play
okay.
the video.
So what I'd like to do now is show you the minute from the clip from which from the way that the signer ended up signing it. And I will mention that the captions that you see draw pretty heavily on the original quote from the curator. So that's how you'll be able to guide you through this a little bit. So I think even if you don't speak ASL, if you're not fluent in it, you can sort of see those horizontal, vertical, the tilting of the canvas and that equilibrium that the artist was seeking.
And something else that you may have noticed that we'll talk about in a second is just also Frank. This is Frank. He's our chief on-camera interpreter, uses facial expressions to help convey some of these ideas. And I will just briefly say that when we were hammering this out together, and that's really what it was, because this tour was so much more conversational conversational and it wasn't scripted. Harry was just kind of riffing and talking about Mondrian in a way that the narration before and the narration after sort of clarified, or that you're listening and you're sort of following along with the painting and understanding. And what we realized when it came to doing this is that you can't do the same thing. You can't make the same set of assumptions with ASL. So it was, for me, a real eye-opening part of the storytelling, and I feel like they did a better job of explaining Mondrian than we did in our audio tour. So on to the next chapter. This magazine article got a lot of attention. This is Chance the Rapper's interpreter named Maxie. He says, although other translators, though, get too literal, Maxie says he's seen interpreters use the campfire ASL sign when, say, a pair of sneakers is on fire, or you're smoking fire next to your window at night to relax. I assume everybody knows what we're talking about there.
And if you want to know what he's doing, dope is like this. Like so this is my truth. So it is. So he's talking about fire. It's metaphorical in English, right? You're saying something's hot, something's cool. You're not going to actually say that it's on fire. If you're smoking fire next to your window, you are smoking fire next to your window. You're not literally having a campfire. So it's interesting to think about that tension between idioms in English and then how you would translate that into ASL, which has its own set of idioms and its own way of communicating things. So we kind of touched a little bit on the fact that that curatorial section that was translated was something that was conversational. At the 9/11 Museum, we very much script our audio tours, partly because our content is quite different. It's not art. It is something that we are very specific about how we talk about. And there are certain ways that we probably euphemistically will talk about certain things that when you actually translate into ASL, there's need to be much more direct. So this video will show is a clip from one of our audio guides. John Feel was a rescue and recovery worker at Ground Zero. He does a whole lot of work about health effects now, and he talks about an accident that he had at Ground Zero where he lost half of his foot. But if I were to sign an ASL that he lost his foot, it would mean it was somewhere in between the couch cushions with his keys, but that's not how it happened. It was his euphemistic way of saying that a huge piece of debris fell on my foot and I had to have half of it amputated. But that's the kind of information that our interpreters needed in order to figure out the right way to explain it. So here you'll actually be able to see sort of the classification of, he's going to show you his foot, he's going to show you something falling on it and something cutting off, even though the captions follow the actual English part, which is I lost half of my foot.
There we go.
You can stop.
Yeah.
You don't need to take it. Yeah.
Yeah. We
great.
got a little ambitious and wanted to play the whole story.
You know.
So
So you can literally see it getting cut off and thrown away. It's quite graphic.
And it was actually a long process figuring out how to do that.
It was.
Yeah.
It required more fact checking than we'd actually done for the English script because we had to go back and ask, like, so you lost it, how'd you lose it? So it was good to know.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about this, just really frankly goes back to the whole inspiration for doing this session to begin with, which is how has our exposure to ASL and accessibility for the deaf community and our work incorporating it, frankly, changed our jobs. And I wanted to have Lorena and Alison sort of talk a little bit about that.
Sure. In the interest of time, I won't go on my soapbox for too long, but that being exposed to different things, I feel like curiosity and generosity of interest is rewarded just by seeing the world in different ways. So happening to stumble upon a language that gave me access to what is ultimately an entirely different culture has made me more thoughtful about how I do my job, and not only in how I think about making room for the deaf community in our physical space and in our exhibitions, but just in how I view the world and how somebody else might see the same thing. I'm also sort of a technologist and a nerd more by practice, so it's also been a really cool and interesting way to explore how technology can help open doors for different people to come. Obviously, we all have a little screen in our pocket, so it's quite simple to create a video version of something in ASL to make somebody feel welcome in their first language. And then you can also look up really cool stuff like the Epson AR glasses that the National Theater is using to actually live caption their theater programs so people who can't hear can actually see. So there's just really cool innovation going on that's fun to follow and makes it joyful for me to be a giant nerd.
Lorena, you want to we've got 4 minutes, you want to make
Sure,
a brief
yeah,
comment?
Just mention very quickly that this is one of the bullet points that it reminds us that variety matters in access, and Julie sort of touched on this in the beginning, that we need to be thinking about all different kinds of people all the time for everything. And what my biggest personal takeaway is that as museum educators, we think a lot about our language and our tone and how we present information. I just went to a whole session on it an hour ago, and it was wonderful about the voices that we use. And so thinking, sort of my experience with sign language in my work and also in my personal life, I'm an intermediate signer myself, makes me think more carefully in my job about how that words matter. I'm thinking about how I present ideas and what is the tone. How can we get at complex ideas in an elegant and straightforward manner?
And to Lorena's point, I will only add that the little joke in our office is when our interpreting team comes to the office, it's the most quiet meeting ever. And for me, sitting and watching and not actually understanding has been very humbling for me to realize why we need to provide accessibility for everyone. So during Hurricane Irma, maybe some of you heard the story about the uncertified interpreter they hired for one of their press conferences who got it very, very wrong. So we wanted to just give you a few quick tips on how to get it right. So it says, sign language interpreter warned of pizza and bear monster at Irma briefing. Take it away, Alison. You want to?
Don't be a bear monster.
Yes.
It's your takeaway for the session.
Yes, don't be a bear monster.
There is a problem in Florida with pizza, so you know.
Yeah, Pizzagate too. So in terms of looking at it from a development side, you basically always want to consider accessibility from the beginning. You don't want to develop yourself into a corner. Think about it as part of your requirements at the beginning. And we sort of are touching on this in two places, but when I say know what you don't know, I'm not a deaf person. I may speak the language. I'm not a blind person. I'm not somebody with limited mobility. I don't have that daily experience. My dexterity with a screen reader is not the same as somebody else's. So bring in people who are actually going to use this to test your assumptions and make sure that you aren't assuming that you are the savior of all things when you make your accessibility app.
I think it's also important to have a sense of your institutional tone and voice when you go into it. For instance, when we were going back and forth on the gloss for the East Building tour, there were a few instances where the interpretation got a couple steps away from the intent, and you're really the voice of your institution, and you need to keep that dialogue going. So Alison mentioned consider accessibility from the beginning, but don't forget to bring it back at the end, because someone's going to have to check those videos and make sure that the signs didn't go awry, and you're suddenly communicating something that you didn't mean to. You want to do your user testing and see what kind of impact it's having. And then the issue of deciding on caption before filming gets at leaving space for captions, deciding where they're going to be, what they're going to look like. That's sort of its own large issue that we're sort of skipping over here. And then leaving time for rehearsal and also having those conversations. This isn't something to rush into. So making sure that you create the space for all of that to happen.
And I will say that in some ways these are our best practices from having worked with a team and having worked with accessibility people in museums. We have learned a lot about the right way to do this, which is sort of echoed in what Lorena and Alison said. We have to sort of zip through, but really we did save the best for last. So I'm going to just quickly play this video and see if you can all guess what sign it is. Hint, it's a 19th century Dutch-French artist. Come on. Very good.
Bingo.
Very good. And so Alison and Lorena had a few signs they wanted to teach you that also convey a little bit about the interesting components of ASL.
Gosh. Well, we can teach you.
might need to stand up.
Yeah, I might need to stand up. So we can do the ones that are less difficult first. I'm sure most people here know thank you, right? You take your full hand with your hand here from your chin. Thank you. It's very nice. Do you want to do museum?
So museum is we're making an M with both hands. M. So you tuck your pinky. You're making a little building. This is a museum. Gallery, you could make your G, gallery, right? So this is the beautiful thing about sign language. It's so adaptable. So cool. Yep.
Technology, we're all technologists here. So I like to think of it as like plugging something in. So you've got a little wire, it's your middle finger. You're going to take your hand straight up and you're going to tap it right on the side. Pins, a bathroom. We don't need to have a bathroom.
President.
Or first we'll do Pittsburgh real quick.
Okay.
So Pittsburgh, you're gonna make the OK sign, and on the same side of your body as the arm you're using, you just put it in your lip pocket. Flick it. Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh.
Yeah, we're not sure why.
I mean, it's a similar sign to benefit. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with like unions or like. It's amazing to see how signs evolve, which transitions us perfectly into president.
President. Can anyone guess the source of that? The tricorn.
More relevant.
The tricorn hat. President George Washington, right? And then our current president. President Trump. No comment.
A little comb over.
And then lastly,
Just as a little comb over.
little like hair.
Yeah,
The hair.
the hair. You can also call him an orange monkey. We won't go there. So something else we wanted to show is how it's different regionally. So I'm from New York. I happen to be a Mets fan, but I will show you the sign for Yankees that you would use if you're a New Yorker. So you put a Y on your head, like you're wearing a little Yankees hat. But
And whoever just booed, here's
so
a sign
this
for you.
is how you're gonna do it. If you're from Boston, you're not a Yankees fan. They're right in your armpit.
It's very expressive.
I think maybe we should just close it there.
There you go. And after a couple of beers, we can show you more rude ones at the thing today.
Or tonight, maybe.
Today, yes. If we're here.